Good afternoon. My name is Austin McCraw. I am the Senior Director of Content Production here at MECLs. In the studio with me today is Michael Lanning. It's a privilege to have you, Michael. Michael Lanning, if you're not familiar with him, he is accredited with kind of coming up with the concept of value proposition. This is a concept that we talk about here a lot at MECLs. He wrote a very great, powerful book in the 90s called Delivering Profitable Value. Today he goes all over the world working with organizations, companies, helping them with their value propositions. And he was recently, earlier today, here at MECLs, talking to the kind of the students here, and just wanted to get him in the studio and be able to kind of throw some questions his way that would potentially benefit you, the audience, to kind of give you some insight that we and some of the cool things we got to hear today as part of our academic lecture series at MECLs. So, Michael, it's great to have you here.
My pleasure, Austin. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I've really enjoyed getting to know some of your folks and getting used to the MECLs culture, which is a fantastic one. I mean, obviously the concept of value proposition is near to my heart, and you guys are very focused on making sure that your clients understand how powerful it is to think through what's the value proposition we're trying to convey and communicate, and how do we make that credible and believable. And all of that, of course, I think is great. Your whole approach of being very data-driven and testing-oriented in order to get to the most effective value proposition that you communicate, I think is fantastic.
Excellent. What I want to do for the audience real quick, I kind of want to go back in time a little bit. You started with Procter & Gamble and you kind of went into McKinsey, and that's about the time the concept for you of value proposition kind of was stirring in your head. So take us back there and kind of walk us through, kind of first off, kind of what were you doing, what was your role, and kind of how that concept of value proposition kind of emerged.
Okay. Well, when I'd been at Procter & Gamble, the culture there is very oriented around making everybody understand the importance of studying and understanding as insightfully as possible the behavior and the attitude and the thought processes of the consumer. The consumer is the source of all success and wealth for a Procter & Gamble, and you learn to try to not only think about the consumer, but try to sort of what I call become the consumer. Study what they're doing, what they're thinking, how they're behaving, and using that understanding and trying to see life through the eyes of that consumer, so that you can come back and say, how can we fashion our products, our packages, the way we distribute through stores, our advertising, everything that we do in such a way as to make that consumer better off in their life by using our products. So that was kind of the natural way of thinking about business and how to make money when I was at P&G. But I had heard that in general, a lot of what happens in packaged goods is particular to packaged goods. It's about consumers, and it's about TV advertising, and it's about a whole lot of aspects of that business which are very different when you get to high tech or to big heavy industry, extractive industries, commodity businesses, long complex chains. Everything works differently. So I wanted to understand, what does that really mean, and what's applicable from what I had learned and what isn't. And so I joined McKinsey & Company, and I had the opportunity to work in a number of businesses that weren't standard consumer packaged goods businesses, and I was around a lot of people who thought about strategy at a very broad, generalized level. And so I was trying to understand, so what is the paradigm? What is the framework? Is it different than what I learned in a consumer packaged goods context, or is it in some ways the same? And what I found, to my surprise to some extent, was it was indeed quite different. That the basic assumption that McKinsey used, and that a lot of the academic approach to strategy used, was to say that a business should be understood as the integration of all functions around the same topic, the same purpose. That made a lot of sense to me. But what was that topic around which the functions should be integrated? Well, the answer seemed to be really the product. What product are we going to make? How are we going to make it? How are we going to sell it? To get those answers right, and we have competitive advantage in doing some of those things compared to our competition, then we'll win. And it struck me that, well, that's not quite the same thing as putting what happens to the customer, be that a consumer or an industrial customer. That's not the same thing as putting that customer's life, their business, what happens to them, as at the center of the business. And when I would ask people about that, they would say, oh yeah, well, so you're talking about marketing. You do that at the end, after you figured out what product to make, how to make it, how to distribute it. Then of course you need to position it to the customer so that the customer thinks that it's a good deal. And I thought, there's something wrong with this picture. There's a long history in microeconomics and in strategy theory to think the problem is we make products and we need to make them in a profitable way, and that includes manufacturing them, designing them, and selling them. So that's the whole question of a business. How do you do that, and how do you do that better than the competition? And the idea of putting the customer in the middle of that is not really natural to that. The idea is the customer is there to fork over some of their spare change in return for the product that we're giving them. So we have to think about the customer, but the object of analysis there is the product or the service. And so most of theory focused that way. And in fact, it hasn't changed that much. That doesn't say that everybody doesn't always say the customer is really important and it's all we care about and so on. The customer is always there as an important topic. But when you take the functional structure that Drucker and everybody else who followed assumed is the right way to look at it, the issues, the key functions, the key processes of the business are to make and sell a product in such a way that at the end of the day we create a customer, fine. Right. But what we're really focusing on is what product to make, how to make it, and how to sell it. And that has to take into account what the customer's needs are. Somewhere in there you can easily lose sight of what's actually going to happen to the customer and only take account of what the customer thinks about your product, wants you to do with your product, and you end up focusing on how to make the product and how to sell the product. A lot of theory developed throughout the 70s and 80s and into the 90s along the lines of we need to figure out how to make and sell products in a way that takes advantage of our competencies, of what we're good at. We have assets. We need to utilize those assets. We need to make the most of what we're good at. Mm-hmm. So we need to make and sell the product in a way that is better than the competition can. I can have that discussion for a long time and kind of lose sight of the customer except as an afterthought. How do I then position to the customer and convince them to be happy with it? What happened at McKinsey was that the business system was a framework that was meant to be the fundamental way in which you define a business and think through strategic choices. And that framework is what's the product or service, how do we create it, design it, how do we make it, how do we sell it, and then you manage all those functions in such a way as to be integrated, which really means trying to make sure that the same product with the same features gets to the to the customer in the same way and in a way that's superior to what the competition can do. And then Michael Porter in his work said, yes, well, the idea of a business to get competitive advantage is you need to have a value chain. And in describing the value chain, he described basically the business system again, and he added some additional functions, inbound logistics and outbound logistics. But it's essentially, again, an ordering and organization of the functions around the product or the service and its making and operation and supply and its marketing and its selling. And if you can do those in a competitive advantage way, you win. Well, that's still focused on the wrong question. I felt where that leads is it ends up encouraging people to fall into one of two fundamental mistakes that I think most businesses, any business, has a tendency to have to fight against. One is being internally driven, and the other is kind of its flip side of the same coin, being customer compelled. Internally driven simply means usually internally driven organizations are very aware of the customer. They usually have a marketing and a sales department and they're selling at the customer. But what they are doing in being internally driven is they are figuring out how to make and sell their product in such a way that takes advantage of doing what they're comfortable doing or what they are good at or feel that they are good at. And so they'll make a product that they're good at and they think is maybe better than what the competition can make, and then they'll take that product, throw it over the wall to the sales force, and say, go out and convince customers that this product is good for them. You end up sometimes, indeed, being lucky and the product you're good at making and the marketing you're good at doing is exactly what the customer wants. But if not, of course, you end up trying to impose on the customer something they don't want. What happens is people notice that usually, and there's lots of literature written about how really you need to be focused on the customer and find out what the customer wants. So we were saying, how should I make the product? How should I sell the product? First answer is, well, I'll figure that out based on what I think I'm good at, what I'm comfortable at, what I think I do well, which isn't exactly crazy, but it may not be what the customer really values. The other answer says, ask the same question. What product to make, how to sell it? Well, we'll ask the customer and have the customer tell us what product to make and how our manufacturing ought to be set up and what our R&D ought to do and how we ought to sell. And the problem is maybe that's better because at least we're listening to the customer a little bit, although we're probably getting a bunch of input that we can't actually profitably act on, and will end up being internally driven anyway. But we're still not focusing on the real question, which is, what is the end result, the events, the experiences that if the customer got them would be most valuable to them?
Right.
And when I get customer compelled, what I end up doing is saying, I'll drive my business by what the customer tells me to do. It's fairly easy to take that input, but there's a number of things that go fundamentally wrong. One, the customer is going to tell me about my product and how it's made and how it operates and how it's sold. That's different than telling me about what happens today for that customer and what would a better scenario look like. Secondly, if I try to give the customer everything that they want, I'm likely to do none of it terribly well and have a hard time making money. But I'm told total customer satisfaction, give the customer what they want, the customer is king. It leads towards trying to do everything for the customer instead of making real choices and deciding what am I going to deny to the customer in order to give them more in some other area. And the customer's not very good at saying, I think you should give me a lot of this, but then take away this other thing so that you're better able to give me this first thing. The customer can't make that decision. They can agree at the end of the day, but they're not going to be the source of that insight. When I started with the idea that the business system as a model, product, make, sell, isn't quite right, and I said, well, it really needs to be about the value the customer gets. And because of Rasa Reeves' work, the idea of the unique selling proposition, which most people have heard of, that's a smart way of talking about what advertising needs to do in communicating to the customer, make a unique selling proposition. It struck me that the business system needed to be replaced by a system that's focused on what we're going to do for the customer. But we're not just selling to the customer, we're actually trying to get them a better set of experiences. We're trying to deliver more value to them. So I like the idea of proposition. Why don't we make it value proposition rather than selling proposition? And so I proposed inside McKinsey, let's change the business system. This wasn't altogether popular at first when I recommended this because the business system was well established as a framework, but I said it's a great idea to have all the functions integrated around the same thing. You've just integrated them around the wrong thing. You need to integrate them, and I'm not going to say around the customer because it's not about the customer telling you how to make and sell the product. You need to integrate around the impact on the customer, the result for the customer, and we're going to call that the value proposition, which is what we're going to offer and actually make happen for the customer, the good and the bad.
Your thinking then was this idea of taking your focus off the product and putting it on the kind of resulting customer experience. So explain that, what you mean by resulting customer experience.
So when I first did that, I said, well, so value, in other words, means benefit, which is how I had learned to think about it at Procter & Gamble, that you offer benefits to the customer, but there are also costs and there's price. So if I take benefits minus price and cost, that should be value. And that's the way economists typically define value. As I thought about it over time, I realized that benefit means well as a word, but people end up talking about the benefit of what? Of the product, not the end result experience that the customer gets, not what actually happens to the customer. And when you think about what you're trying to do for a customer by making your product perform well or anything else that you do, you're trying to influence what happens in their life. And that's not necessarily best described as the benefit as in the benefit of the product. Plus I had noticed over the years everybody says benefit and then they talk about the features of the product after saying we all know the difference between features and benefits, but then they talk about features. It's hard to get away from the product if you're still talking about benefit. Another issue is that in a real value proposition, a winning proposition, it's very frequently the case that you're asking the customer to accept some things that are better than they can get from the alternatives, but also to accept some things that aren't as good or are worse than the alternatives. Price is often one of those, but it can be the fact that you're not delivering some benefits that the competition is offering. So how do I include that in the notion of benefits? Among benefits are non-benefits, negative benefits. I realized the point is, what are the experiences the customer is going to get? And in there I can have trade-offs. I can have poor experiences, negative experiences, as long as those are not more important than the positive experiences. What matters to the customer doesn't have to love you. They just have to decide that of all the options, they'd rather do business with your proposition rather than the other guys. Usually there are trade-offs in that. And so thinking through trade-offs on purpose, not saying, oh, let's not talk about those, let's only talk about our benefits and our advantages, is a mistake. Internally, you may not want to talk a lot to the customer about your trade-offs, although you may in some cases, so that you can explain them to them so they aren't surprised by them. But the point is you want to focus on the customer drawing the net conclusion that overall they're better off. So that really we ought to be talking about the experiences the customer gets. So what do I mean by experiences? I really mean the experiences that result from the customer doing business with us, using our product, using our service, buying from us, getting advice from us, whatever they're doing in doing business with us, that's the experiences that they get are the resulting experiences. So I decided that the value proposition ought to be defined as all the resulting experiences, which includes the positives and the negatives, it includes the price, it includes the cost, it includes anything that is an impact on the customer as a result of doing business with us rather than the alternatives. So I ended up there. Now, later in the 90s, people started talking about experiences as in the experience economy, and that was put in the context of, well, we all know everything has become commoditized, and now there's the internet so everybody can find out the price of everything. Therefore, the product doesn't matter anymore. This is a popular theme that crops up every few years, that no one cares about product any longer. And so what we need to really be talking about is experiences, meaning things that don't have anything to do with the product. So if you're buying a car, never mind how it's actually, pleasant or not to drive the car. What matters is what happens in the dealership, what happens when you go back for service, and what happens on the telephone. Those are the experiences. And if you can make a lot of drama and excitement and make those experiences good, and you can think of that as being service-oriented rather than product-oriented, well, all that kind of makes sense, but wait a minute. The product, like the car, does create a set of experiences for the customer, and they are important and very often more important than those service experiences or what happens when you call on the telephone. So it's all the experiences that you get as a result of doing business with a given business, a given supplier that matters. So it's the resulting experiences. It's not just the experiences that have nothing to do with the product.
Question to you is, who owns the value proposition? Is it marketing? Is it the business leader? Like, who owns it?
There needs to be a general management function in any business that owns the value proposition and everything that's involved, all the assets and all the processes and all the partnerships outside the company that impact whether or not and the profitability with which that value proposition is in fact delivered. So in a organization that has multiple businesses, there ought to be a team with a general manager that has the bottom line responsibility for each one of those businesses. And in my view, that means bottom line fundamental responsibility for determining and evolving over time what the value proposition is we're going to deliver and how we're going to deliver it.
And so, we may have on watching us right now marketers who, they've gone through some courses on value proposition. They've potentially read your book on value proposition, and they have come to the conclusion that, we don't have one. We don't have a value proposition, and in some sense maybe they don't have that much control over the value. Like, what advice would you give someone out there sitting in that circumstance? I don't have a value proposition. Where can I start? How can I begin convincing my...
Well, first off, any business ought to get together. If there's a general manager somewhere in sight, it would be nice to get together with that general manager and the key functional managers. Marketing nor R&D nor any of the individual functions, in my view, if they are separate individual functions, ought to be thinking through an issue like the value proposition alone. The whole point is to get everybody on the same page. We started with the idea that management theory very rightly has all along said we need to integrate all the functions around the same purpose. I'm only suggesting the way to define that purpose is in terms of the value proposition rather than the product. But the point is to get everybody on the same page. So none of the functions should own that. I don't want marketing to think this makes marketing unimportant.
Right.
It doesn't. But marketing shouldn't be the only one that deals with the value proposition. And in fact, too often, you start talking about the value proposition, you talk about the customer, people say, well, we got marketing takes care of that because the marketing takes care of the customer. That's the problem, and I think people have recognized that in marketing for a long time. You can't just have the marketing department worrying about the customer. It's too important for just marketing to be worrying about it. You need everybody to be worrying about it.
Ultimately, you have marketing trying to oftentimes solve a problem with the product itself, with the business strategy itself.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, the way I'm trying to talk about value proposition is it just isn't exclusively at all a marketing problem. And the problem has been traditionally, in part, that businesses and theory to some extent have tended to say, well, stuff that's about the customer, that's really, really important, and we stick it over here on the right end of the business system called the marketing and sale and communication. And yeah, it belongs there, but it also belongs in the rest of the business, where I'm making the product that's going to actually have value or not to the customer, and where I'm providing service. So all of that has to be oriented around the value proposition, and you need all the functions agreeing on that. The way to get functional integration is not to decide which function is most powerful, although you can get there that way. The better way is to get everybody to agree once and for all what the value proposition is we're going to deliver, and let's have every debate on whether to increase our investment in this plant or develop another addition to our product line, or change our distribution, or change our advertising, or to sell online in a different way. All those arguments ought to be being made around what's the best way to deliver the same value proposition. The reality is, if you go into an organization, if you feel like your organization doesn't have a value proposition, don't feel too alone. Most organizations, if you go in and say, what's the value proposition, and you ask people from 4 or 5 different functions, you'll get 4 or 5 different answers. Maybe some will say, I don't know what it is, but most likely you'll get an answer, but it won't be the same answer. That's your fundamental starting point. You've got to get to the same definition of what the value proposition is. Now, how do you get to what the right value proposition ought to be? That's a question of remembering who we're talking about here, yes, which is the customer. And so the point is to go back and, again, I put down the idea of simply writing down what the customer says and go do it. And yesterday somebody came up to me and said, are you really saying we shouldn't listen to the customer? And I'm not saying that at all. I am saying stop listening to the customer and become the customer. And what I mean by that is not really to ignore the customer, but to more profoundly, fundamentally respect and understand the customer by trying to see their set of experiences, their world, their problems, their opportunities through their eyes, the way they see it, and then say, how could that world be made better in what we do? That's taking the customer more seriously than asking them what to do. But it's saying that the point is, we ought to be able to define a difference between what happens today and what would happen if we could make it happen for that customer. If we can make that happen profitably, that's a route to making a lot of money. I can't go and ask the customer what that is, because they're not likely to have a coherent answer to that. But I can ask them what they did last Thursday. What did you actually do? If you're a business, let me talk to maybe 20 people in the business and understand what typically happens, all the processes. And what I'm looking for is what goes on here today, whether it's in a consumer's life or a business, that's imperfect from the standpoint of what they're trying to accomplish. Nobody has everything perfect, so there's always suboptimal aspects of people's experiences. Try to collect those, analyze those, and then say, kind of like a 12-year-old, a little bit naively, well, what if I kind of magic wand style made a much better scenario? What would that look like? Now, try to stay away from science fiction and making up stuff that's utterly impossible, but try not to be too constrained by what we already know the customer won't let us do, and the corporation won't let us do, and the competition won't let us do. Simply improve today's scenario substantially in some imagined time frame, and then say, now, let's start bringing reality into this and ask, how close could we get to making that happen? In answering that, you're getting at what may be a new value proposition, and it's different than what you'll get to if you say, what are we good at? How strongly can we position our product and our capabilities and our competencies? It's also different than what you'll get if you say to the customer, how should we sell to you? What is it you want? Yep. What should we give you? It's getting to a different answer by saying, what's it like to be them? What's imperfect about their life, their experience, their business? What would it look like if it was a lot better? And what would it take for us to give them something better than that? And by the way, I have to take into account somewhere in there the fact that competition is not a stationary problem. They're going to move, and they're going to offer alternatives, and they're thinking about these issues too. And if we make an improvement and bring a better scenario to the customer, competition may imitate the same thing tomorrow morning and do it at 5 cents less, and then we aren't anywhere. So we have to think through what are the competing alternatives, and at the end of the day end up, have I got a value proposition that I can conceive of that I think we might be able to deliver, if we put enough attention to it, profitably, better than the competition or any other alternative?
You've worked with many organizations in trying to discover what is this resulting experience we're trying to create in the life of the customer. What would you say is probably the biggest roadblock or challenge that you see organizations have in this process of trying to figure out what holds them back? What keeps them from finding a value proposition?
Well, first off, a lot of people do find a good value proposition. There are a lot of successful businesses out there. You can't succeed without, in fact, delivering a superior value proposition. Sometimes that's accidental. Sometimes that's lucky, and sometimes it's by pretty smart thinking. So it's not like nobody ever thinks this through and gets it right. But there are a lot of obstacles, and people do stumble, and they're for good reasons. What we have on our desks what our job is, even if our job is to deal with customers, it's to do something specific, some process,
Yes.
some function. I'm going to sell to them. I'm going to meet their needs by giving them the service they need. If I'm in product development, I'm working in the lab on the product. If I'm manufacturing, I'm in the plant. It's hard to get completely outside that and say, yes, but what actually happens in the life of the customer on a factual basis, systematically, documented, understood quantitatively. That's difficult. That's a lot of work. It takes a lot of resource, and people can do a bunch of that work and then disagree exactly what it means. It's not simple, like just running a survey and asking customers what are the 10 most important things we should do for you. It's more complex than that, but it's a lot more revealing. It can be a lot more insightful. But it's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of commitment. And if people are inherently inclined to want to do what serves their function, their career, their silo, what they're good at, you're not going to make that go away by just saying, well, let's all come together and agree that we love customers. That doesn't make that stuff go away. So you're having to overcome that to some extent and end up doing things that aren't maybe necessarily in the best interest of a given functional agenda. They may not even be in the best interest of the near-term profitability of the business. You got to figure out what point are we trying to get to. Over what point in the future are we going to try to deliver some value proposition profitably? That may be a fairly risky value proposition in the near term, and it may undermine the agenda of 2 or 3 important functions. So it shouldn't be surprising if people aren't happy with some of the conclusions. So it's hard to get to the insight, and it's hard to accept the implications of the insight, and they aren't all black and white. It isn't a simple little formula. So there's a lot of reasons that make it difficult. But if everybody could agree that, okay, it's hard, we're not always going to totally agree, we're not always going to get it exactly right,
Yep.
but trying real hard to get it right and trying to get on the same page about it, that's a kind of noble pursuit that makes a lot of sense and gives you a better chance of succeeding than just deciding who's the most powerful one around here or using some simple little formulaic way of deciding these kinds of strategic choices.
Do you find that as you're working, like the in some sense temptation or the bent is to kind of keep swerving back to the kind of product focus versus
Absolutely. You know, the relationship between being internally driven and customer compelled is kind of funny. People come up with the idea of being customer. We'll go to the customer, we'll do surveys, we'll promise them everything. What do you need for total satisfaction? We'll do that. We'll write all that down. We're going to do it. Well, all that leads to a set of things which added up we probably can't do in most cases, and are no different than what competition's hearing. So they're kind of trying to promise the same thing and do much the same thing. So we're not very differentiated, and the more we add on, the more unprofitable it tends to be. So what do we end up doing? Well, we don't just go crazy and say the heck with it. We go back to, among the things the customer said they want, what are the ones that happen to meet what we're good at? Well, guess what that ends up looking like? The same conclusion I would have drawn by figuring out what am I good at. It's not that different usually. The customer compelled approach is a way of kind of reacting to the problem that you can't just try to do what you want to do when the customer doesn't want it. So you go ask the customer what to do. If you don't think that through in the right way, you just end up going back to being internally driven. So I'm suggesting not a mix of those two, as some people think of it. If I on odd days I'm internally driven and on even days I'm customer compelled. No, forget that. There's a third path which says, let me go and study what it's like being the customer. What's their business? If they're a business, what value proposition are they trying to deliver to their customer? Who are their competition? What are they trying to accomplish? Where are they falling short? Do they need to expand their market? Do they need to increase their market share? Are they unprofitable? Is their cost too high? What's wrong with their business? Which maybe you can even get some insight that they haven't figured out about what's wrong with their business. But what ways could their business be improved? And then come back and say, how can we make our value proposition about addressing those issues in a way that's profitable for us?
So has there anything changed in like the nature of customers and the way customers behave, or just in our surroundings, our culture that has impacted your theory in any way?
Certainly a fundamental change that's really important that you guys are very much onto and deal with all the time is that, if you go back 30 years ago, you could sit together, a team with its advertising agency could sit down and develop a positioning, how we want to be understood by customers, how we want them to think of us, and so on. And then you go out and spend a bunch of money communicating that, and with a little bit of luck, customers end up saying, oh, that's how I think about that brand. What's changed fundamentally is that you can't control what people hear about your brand because customers are talking about your brand. They're writing blogs and they're writing tweets and they're making entries onto your website, whether you want them to or not, that end up influencing how other customers think about what you're all about. So you have to accept the fact that you can't control it and craft a positioning and then make it happen. You have to figure out, how am I going to change the way our whole organization behaves, including the way we design our products and what we say on our website, but including more indirect and subtle ways, the way we actually go about making decisions as an organization. Maybe how we treat each other will affect the way we treat the customer. We have to do things in a more indirect way and more based on investment in culture quite often, so that our culture will tend to lead customers to a positive conclusion, because you can't control it as easily as it used to be simply by investing enough money in PR and advertising and crafting. It's got to be more real. So that's a very good thing in my opinion, although sometimes you end up reading something about your company you don't really want to read. But the fact is, it makes it more, you better really deliver that value proposition or it's not going to hold up as well.
One of the examples you gave yesterday in your lecture, an example of a company that over time they shifted their, and maybe they kind of started with it, but over time they kind of solidified their focus on the resulting customer experience. It was Zappos.
Yep.
And at the end, kind of they would summarize their value proposition as delivering happiness.
Yeah.
Correct? In some sense, and maybe an abbreviated version of what they would say.
No, that's what they say.
They say. So
but it sounds a bit silly, doesn't it?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about. There seems to be, as you focus more on the customer experience, you got a little bit more fluffy language. Yep. You get a little bit more subjective, yep. And I can almost hear the customer saying, "Yeah, right."
Yeah.
So
I think if you started by saying we're a shoe company and we deliver happiness, you wouldn't get very far.
Right, right.
I think they simply came to realize that what they are doing involves some concrete things, like Zappos offers. To go back to earlier in their history in the 2000s up through 2008, 2009, they were just selling shoes, and they were really the first serious player to try to sell shoes online, which is an odd proposition because people want to try shoes on. And how are you going to try shoes on? By doing it online, right. And they also want a broad range of brands that they can choose from, and the brands didn't want to do drop shipping, which is how Zappos started, for a broad range of brands. They'd be out of stock on the most popular brands. So a lot of things about trying to do online shoe selling kind of didn't seem like they were really going to work at first. What they gradually realized over time, they learned to stop drop shipping and start carrying inventory and making all the brands available that you could get at brick and mortar and at real retail. But if they could take all the risk and all the cost involved in being able to try the shoes on, and anything you don't want you can give back and there's no charge and there's no hassle, then you might start to get at best of both worlds. I think they figured that out fairly early on. And so earlier they were saying, well, it turns out we're really about not just a huge selection of shoes, but great service. And they realized, really, it's more than great service. We need to do things that have to do with the way our people interact with the customer, because eventually people can imitate all this stuff that we're doing. Free delivery overnight, free returns, great, but that's not that hard to imitate. We need customers to feel something a little extra, and it's kind of an emotional category, shoes. And it has to do with who you are,
fashion, appearance,
a lot of social issues. Absolutely. And so on. So you're kind of dealing with emotion a little bit. Anyway, I've done a lot of work in imaging, and it's much the same thing. You're getting into people's very fundamental emotions there when you're dealing with imaging, because you're capturing their life, who they are, what happened. Well, with shoes, unlike, let's say, buying, books or school supplies online, shoes is a little different because of that emotional element. And I think they figured out pretty clearly somewhere along the line that if we can find a way of going a little bit further with the customer, helping them out, they're going to be anxious sometimes about this decision about what pair of shoes to in fact try. Right. Trying to think through what kind of shoe should I be wearing for this event. If we can occasionally give the customer a little help, a little extra without any charge, that'll cost us more. If we have a call center where we don't pay our people based on how fast they can hang up on the customer, and we don't have them read scripts, and we don't force them to upsell, we instead say, use your judgment, and we try to hire people and make clear that they need to use good judgment, but use your own judgment and figure out how much time to spend with that customer, and do the right thing, and make them feel better, and try to help them a little bit. Now, that doesn't mean spend all day on the phone with every customer that calls, but it does mean You don't have to try to hang up as fast as you can as soon as you've finished a transaction. It means try to build a little bit of a relationship. They concluded that almost all their customers eventually, at some point in time in their life, will actually call Zappos and talk to somebody, and if they get a little bit of help and they get treated with respect and they get treated well, they're going to remember that forever, and that's worth a fortune in terms of lifetime value. So they put a lot of investment into all that stuff. I think Tony Hsieh at the end feels, and sitting back, he says, often our customers come to us and say, I get a box from Zappos the next morning. I just think of it as a box of happiness. And I used to hear that and go, yeah, okay. Right. It eventually dawned on him that actually they've got a point. This is about happiness. It makes people really feel good to get a little bit of help, to then, with a painless, riskless process, be able to get an emotional category like this. So I don't think this works for everything. I don't think Chevrolet should say, oh yeah, we deliver happiness. That's not going to really work. Neither should, if you're selling lawnmowers, you're probably not delivering happiness. So don't just imitate something like that. Yes. It's trying to get at, which took them a long time, the essence of what at the end of the day really is the impact they have on the customer. And it's not a good shoe selection. It's something that goes a fair bit beyond that.
And you would say that they don't maybe necessarily have to put "We deliver happiness" on their marketing collateral in some sense.
I would say that's probably a good idea not to put that.
Right. So let me ask you this: what might they put instead? Like just example. Like so, the idea we want to create in the mind of the customer, the conclusion, is that we deliver happiness. Yeah. But how can they? What can they say, or how can they communicate?
Well, they have a set of 10 core values by which they try to define their culture. And a lot of people talk about culture and talk about how important it is, and usually it's just a bunch of empty words. But sometimes it's real. And Jim Collins' work on Good to Great keeps finding that culture actually in a substantive way is what distinguishes strong cultures, well-defined cultures that are very strongly protected, with people being willing to make trade-offs and sacrifices in order to protect the culture and make the culture stronger, that tends to be associated with a lot of the companies that didn't just do good but became great. And in this particular example, they take some core values that they worked on over a long period of time. One of them starts with deliver wow through service. And they just mean do things with service that surprise and delight the customer and give them a little bit more than normal. But there are a series of other values in there as well. One of them is be humble, which is kind of an interesting one. And you would think, well, what's that really got to do with selling shoes? They decided somewhere along the line that what they wanted and thought was an inherent strength already of their culture was that their people were humble, that had something to do with the way they then interact with customers and make decisions that could impact customers. There's something good about humble. Now, you can debate that, but that's a decision they made, and they said that they use their definition of culture, those core values, to make hiring decisions. So when they hire people, they deliberately kind of screen them for how well they fit with the culture. And if they think somebody's very talented, very capable, could really improve the bottom line, but they're not humble, they're kind of egotistical, and this does happen in the world, you get people like that, they don't hire them. So that's a real commitment to making the culture real. And they, on every page of their website, always have one of those core values restated. Another one is have fun and a little bit of weirdness, something like that. So they're kind of goofy. They aren't really exactly directly related back to why I should buy these shoes, but they kind of resonate with the whole feel that you get from the company and from what you get when you interact with them. And so in that way, I think they very indirectly kind of get at that notion by restating those core values over and over again.
You've said a couple times in this conversation, a key to getting to a value proposition is, in some sense, becoming the customer. Yep. And so that sounds difficult. So if you could, so someone watching this video, they may be thinking, okay, I like the notion of becoming the customer. I think it's a great idea. How can I just, even in the email I'm about to write, even in the the ad I'm about to post, if it's a marketer or if it's a business leader, even about the product we're about to launch, how can I become the customer?
Well, I don't think you can become the customer in what you say to the customer, in your communication to the customer, but you can try to become the customer in order to think through what is it I want to say.
Precisely.
And by becoming the customer, all I mean is take the time, and it takes time, it's a serious investment and resource in the organization to get a lot of people in the organization involved in going out and observing and studying and talking to customers. Now you can take this to the point of doing extremely intensive research, and there's ethnographic research methodologies where people spend 16 hours videotaping a consumer in their home. I'm not sure you have to go that far in a lot of cases, but you can go to customers and ask them, what did you do last week? What happened in this context of this category? What happened? What went wrong? What were the consequences of what you happened? What were you trying to accomplish? Analyze what people are actually doing and what's imperfect about it. I call that creating video one, a picture of what actually happens today. And then try to creatively imagine a much better scenario. Call that video two. And comparing video one to video two begins to get you on the track of a hypothesis that's not based on what the customer said you ought to do. It's not based on what we happen to be good at. It's not based on what the competition is doing. It's based on your best shot at creatively inferring from what the customer is currently doing to what a scenario would look like that would make them a lot happier, a lot better off, would give them a lot more value, make their business more successful, whatever it is that matters to them. And of course, you can't always then just do whatever comes out in that video too. You got to think through, how do we do that profitably and do some of it enough that it actually delivers a superior value to the customer. And that's a starting point. Even before that, I would just say, you're in any business, you're already delivering a value proposition, or if you have numerous businesses, you deliver numerous value propositions. Trying to sort through de facto, what value proposition does your customer get today, for better or worse? What experiences do they get? Don't describe to me how good your product is. Describe to me what the results are for the customer of doing business with you today. Warts and all, good and bad. Try to understand what the baseline is. What do we deliver now? And try to see if that helps explain why your business is as healthy as it is, or is as troubled as it may be and challenged in some ways. That's a starting point. And then the question, of course, is could we deliver a better value proposition than that? And that process of going out, becoming the customer, and systematically studying, which then has to be subjected to quantitative research, but it's a qualitative start. What are the hypotheses we've got as to what improvement could look like potentially for our customer base, and what of that, within that hypothesis, within that video too, what's possible that we might actually do and make happen profitably that would actually work. That's a starting point.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Michael, again, it's a privilege to sit down with you. Great to just kind of hear the concepts in action from the source. Appreciate you taking the time, and I hope you found this conversation helpful, insightful. Again, speaking with Michael Lanning, the author of Delivering Profitable Value, and really the kind of lead proponent of the concept around value proposition. And I hope you found the content valuable, and we'll see you next time.